It's known from multiple dimensions simultaneously that the system that produces happiness, let's say in the founder's sense, produces that emotion in relationship to the observation of movement towards a valued goal. And so you can derive some conclusions from that. The first is that without a goal, there's no happiness by definition, because happiness marks movement towards a valued goal. The next is, well, the higher the goal, the more value there is in the observation of movement towards it. And so out of that, you might ask, well, then what's the highest goal? Because why don't we go for that? Well, then you could say, well, you should do your best for the best. You might say, well, that's just to make me hedonically happy. It's like, well, wait a second, cocaine will work for that, because it actually even activates this system. But what about tomorrow and next week and next month? And so the problem with hedonism as a goal is, first of all, it vanishes when you're suffering. But even failing that, if you're serving yourself hedonically in the narrow sense, it's just about me and my pleasure. It's like, okay, which you? Today's you, tomorrow's you, next week's you, next month's you. What about next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? You're going to lead a hedonic and dissolute life, and what are you going to be, a burnt-out shell and a wreck, a dismal wreck in 10 years? Because that's what'll happen. And so if you don't construe yourself as a community stretched out across time, then you're not even serving yourself. And if you do construe yourself as a community stretched across time, then serving other people and serving yourself turn out to be exactly the same thing. I just did a course on the Sermon on the Mount, and Christ, in one of the sections of that sermon, he says to people that you shouldn't lose your saltiness, you shouldn't lose your savor, and you're the salt of the earth, and without that salt, everything loses its flavor. And salt is a preservative, and it's a spice, and that's often conceptualized, that phrase, as referring to the salt of the earth, the solid, reliable types who bear all burdens. But that is not what it means. I looked at a lot of different translations. I talked to a lot of people about that verse, and really what it means is, well, there should be some spiciness and unpredictability and humor about you. And there should be some play in the system, right? Because that's what stops you from just being the narrow, dead, past letter of the law with no spirit. There should be some snake inside the tree, right? There should be some fire inside the bush. Those are all ways of construing that are symbolically equivalent. There should be some dynamism in you, and a fair bit of that's associated with, well, enthusiasm. That's fun, but enthusiasm means to be imbued with the Spirit of God. That's why people like comedians so much too, because that's what they do. And so you have to leaven the duty with humor, and your book does a lovely job of that too, because your book, which is a very conservative book in the best possible way, and is a call to duty and responsibility, but you constantly return to themes of both stoicism and humor, which are tied together in some sense. I was just in Newfoundland for the last week doing a documentary there, and Newfoundland's a rough rock, and it's beautiful and harsh, and the people there are tough and resilient, man, because they had to be. And Newfies have a great sense of humor, and they're always making fun, and that's a necessary leaven, right? That ability to deal with serious matters in a light touch, and it's something I'm trying to learn to do more and more, even in the most serious of conversations, because if you're a master, you've got both. You've got that light touch and that sense of humor. You really see that in military people who've been through rough situations. You don't have to necessarily have done anything wrong for things to get completely out of control. It's a terrifying doctrine, but it's not a hopeless doctrine, because it still says that there's a way forward, there's a pathway forward, and the pathway forward is to adopt a mode of being that has some nobility, so that you can tolerate yourself and perhaps even have some respect for yourself as someone who's capable of standing up in the face of that terrible vulnerability and suffering, and that the pathway forward, as far as the existentialists are concerned, is by Well, certainly by the avoidance of deceit, particularly in language, but also by the adoption of responsibility for the conditions of existence and some attempt on your part to actually rectify them. And the thing that's so interesting about that is, well, two, as far as I'm concerned, and some of this is from clinical experience, you know, if you take people, and I've told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created, to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, and another way that you could act in the world, so what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. My experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste, and the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be who knows how much more efficient, 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time, not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal, or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that. Well, so you're moving from point A to point B in your little circumscribed world. You've made everything invisible, and as long as that works, then your theory's good enough. It's accurate enough, it's true enough, you're in your little paradise. But if something comes up and objects, well, that's where your character is tested fundamentally. That's the character test. It's like, what do you do with messages of error? And that's a tricky issue. Okay, so here's a solution to that. Here's what not to do. I am a bad person. I got to see myself. I'm a bad person. I might as well just go jump off the bridge. It's like, no, that's not good, because what that means is that every time you try to learn something, you're going to make a mistake, because what do you know? So you're going to make mistakes. And if the rule is every time you make a mistake, you're going to go jump off the bridge, then that's not a useful problem-solving strategy. And so when you make a mistake, you don't get to beat yourself to death with a club. It's a bad strategy, and you'll have your internal tyrant in there who's perfectly happy about doing that. That's the, overactive superego that Freud talked about. Maybe it came to you via a parent who was too authoritarian, or a grandparent, or maybe it's just you because you're disagreeable and neurotic, and so you'll take or hyper-conscientious, you'll take yourself apart. Well, You've got a problem. Something has objected to you. Then the question is, well, what does that mean? Well, maybe you're not looking at the world right. Maybe your goals are wrong. Maybe you're not acting properly. It's okay. So the question that arises when an obstacle emerges is, which part of this structure needs attention? And the first answer can't be all of it, which is why when you're arguing with someone in an intimate relationship and you're angry at them and you want to win, which is a big mistake, you want to win, you say, well, this is what you're like. Here's another 10 examples of how you've done that in the past, and I can enumerate more of them if you'd like. And so that's actually what you're like, and I've tried fixing you and it didn't work, and so it looks like you're going to be like that up into the future. And you're basically saying to them, well, you're a bad person, and the only thing they can do is either collapse or punch you. And punching you is actually better than collapsing. You know what I mean? It's such a counterproductive way of arguing. You don't leave the person any out. And so maybe, well, they're civilized, so it doesn't get physical. Well, maybe that's good and maybe it isn't. But then they end up either really not happy with you in a way that they will manifest the first possible opportunity they get, or they have to go off in the corner and cringe. It's like, great, you won. It's like now your partner's either hates you or is cringing. It's great. That's a real good victory, man. Rack up about 100 victories like that and you'll be in divorce court and spending $250,000 while being miserable about it. Yeah. So anyway, something objects to you and you think, okay, well, I need to take myself apart, right? Because there's a piece that's broken somewhere. And then you might think, well, let's assume it's a little piece to begin with. That's the right mechanism. It's like, okay, you got a C-. That doesn't prove that you're stupid. Now, it implies that you might be stupid, but it doesn't, right, really, it does, and that's why you don't want to look at it. Maybe it implies that you're lazy, or implies that you're ignorant, or like it implies all sorts of terrible. Might imply that you're a bad person even. But you don't want to leap to that, and that's sort of the proclamation of innocence before guilt. Assume that you're the least amount of reprehensible and ignorant possible. And so then you look at the micro routines. It's okay, well, I got a C- in this course. Maybe I should study for that course 15 minutes more a day for the next 3 months. And then you ask yourself, do you think you could do that? No, I'm too useless. Okay, how about 15 minutes every second day? You think you could do that? You put it in your schedule, like 15 minutes every second day in the morning. And that's, well, you think, well, what's wrong with me? Well, I'm not very good at managing my study schedule. That's not quite down here at the behavioral level, but it's pretty close, because what you can take an action. You can open up your schedule and you can say, oh, I'll mark 15 minutes aside. Then you can practice doing that. It's pretty low level in the hierarchy. It means, well, you're still not a horrible person. You just got to polish up your work ethic. And so what you want to do is it's like the old adage, you got to stand up for yourself, but you don't want to make unnecessary enemies. That's a really good thing to know. It's like, shut the hell up most of the time, but now and then you don't shut up because it's time to say something. You don't want to make unnecessary enemies, though. Well, you don't want to take yourself apart any more than is absolutely necessary. Start little, and you do that with people around you too. Like if you have a child, and the child does something that isn't right, then you think, okay, minimal necessary intervention. What can we do to decrease the probability that that's going to occur in the future? And that's a good thing to know with children. It's also a good thing to know with your partners. You're having an argument with them. It's like, okay, what the hell do you want? What's the minimum thing you can request from them that would satisfy you? And the evil part of your soul is going to be, I want them cringing in a corner. It's like, yeah, get that stuff under control, man. See if you can figure out what that person could offer you that would be minimal that you would accept. And then tell them that. It's like, here's the words I would like you to say in the apology I would like you to formulate, assuming that you think you did something wrong. We have to argue about that because maybe you didn't. But if you did, I want to specify it precisely and narrowly, and I want to give you an escape route. And you might only be able to do it badly because you're still mad. So you apologize half-heartedly. It's like you get a pat on the head for that. Good. Next time it'll be 51%, not half-heartedly. Right? So it's careful training. It's careful training of yourself and other people with the goal in mind, but also with the least amount of harshness possible. And then the other thing to do as well, and this is also true for you, and this is something I learned from studying the behaviorists, is like watch the people around you like a hawk. Whenever they do something that you think is good, you tell them. That's wisdom, man. You'll get so far with that you cannot bloody well believe it, because most people, they're afraid of any number of things. But one of the things they're really afraid of is that now and then they'll creep out of their cynical shell and try to do something good. You know, it's like they're popping out this thing that's unbelievably vulnerable. They'll try to do something good and creep right back into their persona. And they'll look around, see if anyone noticed. And sometimes they'll get punished for it, and then, well, then they won't do it again, so don't do that. But then, now and then you think, hey, I saw you do this. That was actually pretty good. And they think, oh, wow, someone noticed. You know, it's like, wow. And then they'll think, yeah, I could do that again. And if you want to live with someone for a long period of time, I would say every time they do something that you would like them to do more of, number one, notice. Number two, tell them, right? Because I know you don't want to, because you really want to dominate them, and you don't want them thriving, because then they'd be competition to you, and you wouldn't be able to go complain to your mother about what a miserable partner you have, and you know how delightful that is. So you have to forego all that pleasure if you actually helped your person develop. So you got to get over all that. It's really annoying. So, you know, you've got this person pegged as, yeah, you're stuck with them, and, you know, maybe it's the best you can do, but you got one eye open. And then every time they do something good, you don't want to notice, because if that elevated them a little bit, you wouldn't be able to feel so resentful and miserable and keep your eye open for the next possible affair. And that is what people are like. That is what people are like. And that's what you're like, too. That's what people are like. So you got to decide if that's what you want, or you want to help the person that you're with grow, you know. Now, it's dangerous, because they might outshine you. Well, good. Then you have someone to compare yourself to. That'd be a good deal. It's really rough with kids, you know, because parents will stop their children from succeeding beyond them. They get jealous. And then they'll put them down. And then they have kids that do not like them. And they'll pay for it. I saw, hypothetically, an increased war on male play and interest preferences that made itself manifest, I would say, with the hyperfeminization of the school system. And then as well, there was the communicated insistence that male ambition was toxic, that competitive games were bad, and that, you know, to the degree that the patriarchy is a corrupt institution, that any sign of that demand for victory, let's say a competitive victory on the male front, was actually a sign of psychopathology. So I think part of the reason that the boys have been demoralized or are failing to participate is because they've been demoralized, and that's provided them also with an excuse to be irresponsible. Look, Nietzsche said you're best punished for your virtues. So the conclusion is if you're going to be punished for being ambitious and goal-directed, then that's going to be very effective as a punishment, but it also gives you every reason to, you know, to bow out and to be irresponsible. So I don't know what you think about that in combination with the things that you're seeing on the, you know, the more specifically technological front.
Yeah. Well, so the boys' story is different from the girls' story, and it's a story of checking out of the real world. And I draw from this in part on Richard Reeves, who's a wonderful book of Boys and Men. He points out that, you know, boys and men used to dominate the economy and society in many ways. But beginning in the 70s, we get the transition away from physical work and longshoremen and strength and to a service economy. And we get, and girls are rising, which is great. But as girls are rising, boys are not rising too. In some ways, they're falling. And by 1980, I think it is, half of college students were female. Now it's 60% are female. So boys have been kind of checking out of school, checking out of the workplace. The electronic world, the online world's gotten better and better, more and more attractive for boys. They're spending more time on video games. So it is a story of male achievement, male motives being kind of hijacked or turned towards trivial, pointless pursuits that don't add up to anything. And so I would agree with you about the discouragement of male ego, ambition, desire to be great, the subversion of that into just wanting to do, you know, higher up on a video game leaderboard, I suppose. But, you know, I'd love to ask you, you know, because I only really began turning to the boys' story about 3 or 4 years ago when I began working on the book. You've been talking to young men for a long time now. Mm-hmm. What do you see when you look at the malaise among young men, I mean, part of it is what you just said about, but just what's your diagnosis about what's happening to young men? Is it depression, anxiety? Is it hopelessness? What do you see happening?
Well, a huge part of it's fractured demoralization. Like, one of the things I've really noticed, it's quite the stunning and horrifying thing to see. I think the biggest impact what I've said on young men has been my drawing of a relationship between meaning, adventure, and responsibility. It's like, well, and you touch on this in your book, like one of the things you point out. So let me take a bit of a sideways route here. When the big five theorists were laying out the semantic webs associated with negative emotion, neuroticism, McCrae, in particular with the Neo Big Five, noticed that self-consciousness and neuroticism were so tightly associated semantically that they were indistinguishable. So here's the rule. This is the rule, and you allude to this. If you think about yourself, you are going to be anxious and miserable. Those are the same thing. And you know that when you're possessed by a bout of self-consciousness. It's not pleasant. Okay, so then you might say, well, what do you do about that? And one answer would be, well, don't focus on yourself. But you can't not focus on yourself. You have to focus on something else. Okay, so what do you focus on if you're male? Well, you focus on responsible service to the future and others. Well, why? Well, because that gives you what you described as that slow dopamine kick. It's like that's where, and that's not happiness, it's meaning. Those are very different things. Happiness is that like hedonistic kick that can be hijacked by the AI machines. Meaning is less intense but more sustaining. Okay, so where do you find that? And that's simple. You find that in the adoption of maximal responsibility. That's burden, that's challenge, that's play if you do it right. That's also the sacrifice that civilization is founded on. And one of the things that we might note, Jonathan, is that the default man is useless. Right? So, so for example, I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but I don't really care. So in the Arab world, broadly speaking, the Arab world produces about as much as Spain. Okay, well, why? Well, it's part of the reason is the men don't work. Now, that's not surprising. What's surprising is that any men ever work, because work is difficult and it requires sacrifice. And so the question is, and this is the anthropological question, the question of initiation, how do you socialize and civilize men? Because the default is going to be trivial hedonism. Of course it is, because it's easier. Of course it's going to be the default. The default's always what's simpler and more fragmented. Well, you tell them a story of heroic responsibility, and you draw, even more importantly, you draw a connection between responsibility and adventure. And so it's so interesting because so many men have reflected this back to me, and I literally mean thousands, because I've said, what you do is you look for the maximum burden, and you note that in service to that, you find meaning. And so you can do that with truth. You can do it with responsibility. And the young men will come up to me, and they do this daily, I would say, and say, 5 years ago, I decided I was going to start taking responsibility for myself and tell the truth. And like everything's changed in consequence, everything. And so what we're doing this bigotry of soft expectations with men. And one of the things I got right at the beginning was, see, the male attitude towards younger men isn't the feminine ethos of acceptance. So you could imagine the dynamic in a family is that this is a stereotype, but I'm going to go with it anyways. The mother says to the child, "You're lovely the way you are." And the father says, I kind of like you, but you could be a lot more. And those are good. Those are really good together, because when the child goes out from the mother, he's encouraged, let's say, by the masculine, go out. And then when he's exhausted, or she's exhausted for that matter, she can come back to the mother and be accepted. And that's the standard pattern of, security seeking and then exploration. Now, what I've been doing with young men is saying to them, you could be a lot more than you are. And it's an insult in a way, because it means you're not good enough now, but it prioritizes the optimized future self. And that's actually hugely advantageous, and so I think what we're doing that's wrong with young men, well, and I think we're doing it to young women too in a more subtle manner, is not asking, not requiring, or even demanding nearly enough. So they default to trivial hedonism, obviously.
If you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way in your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men preferentially do. That's all they do. They work like 70, 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're staking everything on the small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain. But it's hard on them. They don't have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They don't know how to take any leisure activity. Like, they get very one-dimensional. Now, it may be that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing, right? Because if you're going to be something like a genius-level mathematician, and you want to do that or a scientist, say, it's like you're in your lab all the time, you're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week, you're smart, you're dedicated, you're unidimensional, and that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing that. It's the only way. But the problem is, you don't get a life. Now, if you love being a scientist and you have that kind of focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person, and second, you're going to pay for it. But fine, more power to you. But it's a risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it. And I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more. So, you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Well, those 3 things alone, or 4 things alone, are plenty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is, the more you strive to optimize that balance, the less likely you are to be fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a very, if you consider your life as a whole, that might be a winning strategy. One of the things Carl Jung said, I really liked this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. There's something different at the top of the value hierarchy. So perfection would be stake it all on one thing and look for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they don't, but we're talking about extremes, at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, well, it's like I want one thing in my life to be 150%, or I want 5 things in my life to be 80%. Well, there's a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%, but you're not operating at any of them at 150%. So, and I really believe this, because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for a long period of time, and one of the things that, there's lots of things that produce this, but one of the things that I've noticed is that mostly women in their 30s bail out of unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in the 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate that particular area. And it isn't, the reason that they won't do it is because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, really, that's what you want, because that means that's what you do, because you're competing with other people. They're smart, they're hardworking, and if you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. I mean, it also means working diligently, but in the final analysis, it's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week, and you do it for 30, it's like, in 2 years, I'm so far ahead of you, you will never, ever catch up. So, anyways, And I think partly, maybe part of the reason too that women are oriented that way more than men, I think there's two reasons. One is socioeconomic status does not make women more attractive on the mating market, but it does make men more attractive. And the second is women's time frame is compressed, right? Because guys can always say, well, I'll have kids later. And they can say that till they're like 80. Whereas women, it's like, no way, man. You got to get it together by the time you're, let's say 40, but really probably by 35, but definitely by 40, because otherwise it ain't happening. And that's bloody dreadful. One of the common routes to extreme unhappiness is to want children and not have them. I wouldn't recommend that. You know, you see couples who are in their 30s. 1 couple in 3 over the age of 30 has fertility problems. That's defined as inability to conceive after 1 year of trying. 1 in 3. So it's worth thinking about, because people are very, very unhappy if they want to have kids and then they can't. Man, you're in the medical mill for 10 years if that's what happens to you. We've got a hypothesis that we're still working out that's supported to some degree by the relevant literature. So imagine that you're looking for a stable partner, right? So you might think, well, what do you want in a stable partner? And at least in principle, one of the things you don't want is too much mismatch between you and that person on the 5 fundamental dimensions. So for example, if you're really extroverted and you have a really introverted partner, you're going to engage in continual conflict about how much social activity the two of you should subject yourself to. And it's very, very difficult for people who widely differ on those dimensions to come to consensus, because it's not just a matter of opinion, right? It's really a matter of different, if you're looking at extremes, of really different types of people. And the thing about introverts is they just don't enjoy large-scale social interaction that much. One-on-one they're often fine, but in a group they don't like that, and it tires them out. Whereas a real extrovert, it's like you isolate them and they just wither on the vine, because a huge part of what actually motivates them in a positive way is tangled up with social interaction. And so if you're an agreeable person and you have a particularly disagreeable partner, you're also going to run into problems, because the agreeable person will say whatever you want, whenever, and the disagreeable person will say, well, I'd like to know what the hell you want for a change, and be much more harsh and much more demanding in the situation. And the agreeable person is going to find the disagreeable person harsh and unpleasant, and the disagreeable person is going to find the agreeable person wishy-washy and unable to stand up for themselves. And again, that's actually one of the primary sources of tension between men and women, because women tend to be higher in agreeableness than men. It's about half a standard deviation, which is quite a large difference by psychological standards. And so what that means, I probably haven't got the statistic quite right. If you have a group of men and women and you pick out random pairs, the woman is going to be more agreeable than the man 60% of the time. So that's not an overwhelming proportion, but it's reliable, and it's quite large by psychological standards. So there's the problem with agreeableness. With conscientiousness, well, if you're conscientious, you're industrious and orderly. And orderly people seem to be sensitive to disgust, which is something we'll talk about in detail later. We've had a hard time specifying exactly what makes industrious people industrious, because it's hard to come up with an animal model for that sort of thing, and there's no theoretical model. But our latest idea is that, it's not my idea, it's actually the idea of my graduate student, Christine Brophy, is that industrious people find it unpleasant and unsettling to not be doing something.
There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison, because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much, well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day.
You're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them, because they're not like you. You know, they don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win. Be careful who you share good news with, because you want to share good news with people who are going to be genuinely happy for you, and that's one way that you can identify those people who are totally on your side. Be careful who you share bad news with, because that's equally tricky. You know, you want someone who will listen to you when you're having trouble and allow you your grief, especially if it's a consequence of something tragic, and who won't try to one-up you, you know, because often when you're talking to people, they'll be thinking about what they have to say that's worse, and that's not helpful if you need a listening ear. Make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. I talked a lot already about the necessity of cleaning your room, which is, you know, in some sense a foolish piece of advice because it seems so obvious, but it's not obvious at all. And you'll find if you try it, especially if you're in a household that's not very functional, that you'll encounter obstacles that you couldn't imagine existed while you're trying to put your life in order. And you can take your surroundings beyond order and move towards beauty, and that's unbelievably useful.
One of the things that I've been so you know, there's lots of different ways to interpret the world, and you can maybe even make a case that there's an endless number of ways to interpret the world. And the problem with that is that it kind of disorients you in terms of what you should be doing. But just because there's a very large number of ways to interpret the world doesn't mean there's a very large number of productive, meaningful, and sustainable ways to interpret the world. And one of the things you do have to do is figure out how you can conduct yourself today so that you don't upset the apple cart in a week or a month or a year. And so, you know, what you do in some sense psychologically is you admit to yourself that your current frame of reference is faulty. Mm-hmm. And then you start opening the door to a different kind of thinking, which is more creative thinking. It's more lateral thinking. Saying, well, I'm wrong, but that's not necessarily a problem because I could be right if I thought some other way. Well, you know, that's great. Often it works.
Yeah.
And there's almost no end to the utility of trying to figure out which ways that you're wrong.
Yeah.
Because there's lots of them. And every time you discover one, then you don't have to be quite so wrong anymore. That's a really good deal.
Yeah.
It's from the uphill climb that we derive our value, and I mean this technically. So almost all the positive emotion we feel, especially the emotion that fills us with enthusiasm, and that's experienced in relationship to a goal. And so in some sense, you want a goal that you can never attain. So you can always move closer to the goal that recedes as you move towards it. You think, well, that's frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. But it's not, because as you pursue that goal, you put yourself together and your life does get better and richer and more abundant. And that's why the highest levels of virtue and goal are in some sense transcendent. You want them to be above everything you're doing so you can continually move towards something that's more sublime and better. That's what you are. You're here to live, not to sleep. And the problem with the vision of Mai Tais on the beach is that, well, first of all, that's a vision of drug-induced unconsciousness. Second, it's only going to work for about a week. Third, you're going to be a laughingstock in a month and depressed and aimless and goalless. You want a horizon of ever expanding possibility. And so it does happen to people because they've staked their soul on the attainment of an instrumental goal. And it can be a pretty high order goal, but then you think, now I'm there, now what? Well, the answer can't be, well, I'm going to live in the lap of luxury and never have to leave what do you want to be, a giant infant with a gold bottle? You never have to do anything but lay in your back and suck. It's like, you see the problem with that as a conceptualization. It's no, you want to be like an active warrior moving uphill with your sword in hand. And that's dynamic, that's exciting.
Lay a disciplinary structure on yourself. Get the chaos in check. And then you can move towards a state that's freer. It's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. And so in virtually every freedom that you have in life that's true freedom is purchased at the price of discipline.
but it's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you.
And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you as in need of repair, that you could repair, then hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. Now, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial. You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you know, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do, hands down. People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure, because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be, predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces. Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good, by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable, because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. What, do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile. The great people I know are brutally truthful to themselves and other people, and they have insanely adventurous lives. Get rid of everything you say that you only say to impress other people, and just see if you can say what you believe to be true. That's an adventure. That's the thing about the truth, you know? Well, you got to ask yourself, if you're not speaking the truth, who is it that's talking? If you're saying something that you do not believe to be true, it's not you talking. It's something else. It might be the part of you that wants to manipulate the other person into delivering what you think you want from them. Well, what is that spirit of manipulation that you've allowed to possess you? It's not you. Let's say you decide to live your whole life in that instrumental manner. You're going to craft your words like the student who says, well, I'm going to write what the professor wants to hear so I get the grade. It's like, well, you just turn yourself into that. Well, who is it that's doing that manipulating? It's not you, because those aren't your words. So even if you get the grade, it's not you that got the grade. It's the false you. It's the manipulative you. So you do that your whole life. You don't have your life. And then you think, well, God, that was a miserable life. I manipulated everybody. They were so damn stupid. They were sucked in by it. They're all contemptible. Everyone does it, you know, which they don't, by the way. And so that's a pathway to bitterness, partly because if you're a manipulator and you use your language falsely, you don't live your own life. You live the life of whatever possesses you when you think it's you manipulating. And so you live the life of the spirit of manipulation. You know, maybe you're in California, see someone speeding down the road in a convertible Porsche, and you think, oh man, what a lucky bastard. And the truth of the matter is that he's thinking about wrapping his expensive sports car around the next cement pillar that he comes close to. You know, you can't tell, and people have hard lives, and even people who are comparatively fortunate have hard lives. And the ideal that you're observing that makes you jealous and resentful is in large part an illusion that's created by your own mind. You have to be careful of what you're jealous of because you don't really know what it is. And then the other thing that's kind of useful is to understand you're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them because they're not like you. They don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you. The internal problem is, how do you deal with tragedy and malevolence? And you can say, well, I'm not prepared. It's like, yeah, fair enough. Unsurprising, especially if you were overprotected as a child. It's not a good idea to overprotect your kids because the snakes are going to come into the garden no matter what you do. And so then you, instead of trying to keep the damn snakes away, what you do is you arm your child with something that can help them chop them into pieces and make the world out of them. So that the trick for human thriving in the face of suffering and malevolence is strength, not protection. It's a completely different idea. We also know this clinically. We know, for example, that if you treat people with exposure therapy for agoraphobia, which is roughly speaking the fear of chaos, I would say, the fear of everything, you don't make them less afraid. You make them braver. It's not the same thing. Because with an agoraphobic, see, what happens to them is the fall. They never conceptualize death and suffering. They're naive. Right? It never enters the theater of their imagination, and it's because they're protected from it. But then something happens. This often happens to women in their 40s because they're the people most likely to develop agoraphobia. Something happens. They've been protected from chaos by authority their entire life. So maybe they had an overprotective father, and then they went to an overprotective boyfriend, and then they went to an overprotective husband. And maybe they were willing to be subjugated to all three of those because of the protection, right? So that's the bargain. They stay weak and dependent, and maybe they have to because that's the only way they can appeal to the person who's hyperprotective. But the price they pay for that is that they're not sufficiently competent. And then something happens in their life, often in their 40s, they develop heart palpitations, maybe as a consequence of menopause. Their heart starts to beat erratically, and they think, oh no, death. It's like, well, who are you going to talk to about that? Right? There's no protection from authority for that. Or maybe their friend gets divorced, or maybe their sister dies, or something like that. It brings up the specter of mortality, and maybe the specter of malevolence and mortality, and it brings it up in a way that authority, recourse to authority, cannot solve. And so then they have panic attacks. What happens? They go out, they get afraid, they feel their heart beating, then they get afraid of their heart beating because they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and I'm going to make a fool of myself while I'm doing it and attract a lot of attention. So the two big fears come up. Mortality and social judgment. And then they have a panic attack. It's like fight or flight's gone out of control. Very, very unpleasant. Then they start to avoid the places they've had a panic attack. Then they end up not being able to go anywhere. So then Tiamat has come back, right? A huge monster, a little victim. And so what do you do with them? Well, there's no saying, no, there's no Tiamat. That's done, right? Their naivety is over. They've had a direct contact with the threat of mortality and social judgment. They've met the terrible mother and they've met the terrible father. And there's no going back. There's no saying, oh, the world is safe. It's not safe. Not at all. It's not safe. The fact that you think it's safe means that you were living in an unconscious bubble that was sort of provided to you by your culture. It's a gift. And now that's been shattered. And so now what do you do? Well, the answer is you retreat until you're in your house and there's nowhere you can go. You're the ultimate frozen rabbit, right? And your life is hell because you can't function. The alternative is, let's take apart the things you're afraid of. Let's expose you to them carefully and programmatically. And then you'll learn that you're actually tougher than you think. You never knew that. And maybe you didn't want to take on the responsibility because, people play a role in their own demise, so to speak. When you had opportunity to go out and explore or withdraw because you were afraid, you chose to withdraw because you were afraid. So it's not only that you were overprotected often, it's that you were willing to take advantage of the fact that you were overprotected and run back there whenever you had the opportunity. So maybe you're a kid in the playground, right, and you're having some trouble with other kids, and in the back of your mind, I should deal with this myself, but you go and tell your mom and get her to intervene. And you know that that's not right. You know that you're breaking the social contract, but it's easier, and so that's what you do. You run off to an authority figure and hide behind the Great Father, roughly speaking. Well, the problem with that is you don't learn how to do it yourself. So then you have to relearn it painfully when you're 40. So then you take people out, you say, well, what are you afraid of? Rank it from 1 to 10. So 10 is, make a list of 10 things you're afraid of. The thing you're least afraid of we'll call number 10. So we'll start with that. Okay, well, I'm afraid of elevators. Okay, well, let's look at a picture of an elevator. Let's have you imagine being in an elevator. Let's go out to an elevator and let you watch the terrible jaws of death open, because that's how you're responding to it symbolically, right? And you're going to do that at the closest proximity you can manage. You find out, you go do that, it works. You're nervous as hell, especially from an anticipatory perspective. Shaking. You go out, you stop, you watch it happen, and you actually calm down. You do that 10 times and it no longer bothers you. Well, what you've learned that you didn't die, but more importantly than that, you've learned that you could withstand the threat of death. That's what you've learned. And then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and finally you're back in what's no longer the elevator from a symbolic perspective. It's a tomb, right? It's a place of enclosure and isolation. And you learn, turns out I can withstand that. And then you're much more together, much more confident. And that's often one of the things that often happens in situations like that. I've seen this multiple times, is that if you run someone through an exposure training process like that and toughen them up, they'll often start standing up to people around them in a way they never did before, because they wouldn't stand up for themselves before because they weren't willing to undermine the protection. See, if you're protecting me, I can't bother you because I can't afford to forsake your protection. So if I'm going to play that game, I'm going to hide behind you, then I can't challenge you. So that's no good, because that's sometimes why people, you see this with guys very frequently, they're still deathly afraid of their father's judgment when they're in their 30s or 40s. It's like, well, why? No, because they still want to believe that there's someone out there that knows. And so they're willing to accept the subjugation because it doesn't force them to challenge the idea that there's someone out there that knows. Because that's the advantage of having your father as a judge, right? Because he knows. Well, what if he doesn't? What if no one knows any better than you? Well, that's a rough thing. You don't, until you realize that, you're not an adult, right? That's really technically the point of realization of adulthood, is that no one actually knows what you should do more than you do. I mean, it's a horrible realization, because what the hell do you know? It's a terrible realization, and people will often pick slavery, permanent slavery, to the spirit of the Great Father, let's say, over that realization, and it's completely understandable. But the problem with it is that there's more to you than you think, and so if you continue to hide behind that figure, then you never have a chance to understand that there's more to you than you think, far more to you than you think. Maybe there's enough to you so that you can actually withstand the threat of mortality without collapsing, maybe even withstand the threat of malevolence without collapsing. Who knows? It's certainly possible. And it's not an abstract question. It's exactly the sort of question that you address in the psychotherapeutic process. It's always the question that you address. And the answer is often in the affirmative, because people can get unbelievably tough. And you know that because people work in emergency wards in hospitals, right? Or they work in palliative care wards, or they work as mortuary assistants. I mean, these people have bloody rough jobs, or they're on the front line of police investigation into, heinous child abuse crimes, and so they're confronting malevolence on a regular basis. And those are very stressful jobs, but people do them, and some people do them without even being damaged by them, although that's a harder thing, because you can see horrible things, things you'll never forget.
What has been your experience with dealing with these men who have these nice guy tendencies, who can't stand up for themselves, who their moms raised them to be this type of anti-man?
Yeah, well, sometimes that can also be temperamental, right? Because if a man happens to be high in agreeableness, this is also true of women. They're much more conflict averse and they're nicer in their temperament. So if you get an agreeable boy, let's say, who also has a doting mother, then you might have that problem. There's other ways of having that problem, but that's one way. Well, when I saw people like that in therapy, they were often resentful and angry and passive aggressive and getting in their own way, often to spite, whoever was doting on them, let's say. And so the first thing I would do is listen to why they were there, and then start to unpack that anger, and then start to work with the individual to figure out how to voice that. You have to separate out what's old history and useless, and what's just narcissism and infantilism from genuine concerns. But if you listen to people, they will sort that out for themselves. That's one of the cool things about being a therapist, is if you listen, that happens more or less by itself. And then as a behavioral psychologist, maybe someone like that would need a raise, but would be afraid to ask their boss. Well, we just practice that. It's like, okay, well, first of all, why should your boss give you a raise? Like, there might be good reasons. He doesn't want to lose you because you're a good worker. Well, are you a good worker? And if you weren't, well, we'd solve that problem. Put yourself in a position where you deserve the raise. Okay, well, now you're too timid or you're too unskilled, because you have to differentiate those two things too, because some people who can't stand up for themselves actually don't know how, whereas others are afraid, and some are both. And so you have to figure out, so some of it's skill training. Well, how do you actually ask your boss for a raise? Well, you tell the truth. That's the best way. You say, look, here's what I'm doing. Here's why it's really useful for you. It looks like I'm somewhat underpaid in this role. That's demotivating me, possibly. I also have other options. I think I need, 15% more, and I'm interested in moving up, and here's what I'll do for you if you do that. And so, think about it. And then if your boss doesn't do that, and all that's true, well, then you should be assertive enough to find another job. Or maybe you look for another job before you even ask for the raise. Put your CV together, right? Update it so you're not afraid to look for another job. All this is strategic thinking. That was another thing that was really fun about clinical work. Most of my clients, they doubled or tripled their salaries within 3 or 4 years. Wow. They worked at it. This wasn't nothing. This was major league strategic planning. And that was true for women and men, and that's very fun to watch that happen. Think clearly about it, right? And get your act together, and you got to see what's getting in your way. So maybe you're afraid to ask your boss for a raise because if he says no, you'd have to look for a job, and you don't have your resume or CV updated. And the reason you don't have it updated is because you're embarrassed about the lacks in it, and you don't want to face the lacks because then you'd have to see how you didn't get educated properly because you were useless, and you'd have to take steps to rectify that, and it's a real mess down there, right? Yeah. The reasons you're not asking. So we'd lay that all out and then say, well, you're embarrassed about your resume. Well, update it and let's take a look at it. Okay, well, here's some holes and they're not good. What could you do to fix those? And then you break it down into small steps, right? Implementable steps. That's very practical. So that's a good thing to know. If you have your sights set on a goal, you'll move towards it if you break the steps down small enough so that even someone as useless as you will do it. And that also requires a fair bit of humility, because what you might find, especially if you're avoiding something, is that the step you are actually willing to take is so small that you're embarrassed to admit it to yourself, so you won't take any steps at all. Well, that's completely counterproductive. And the reason that's not proper thinking, let's say, or productive thinking, is that, well, small steps get bigger real fast. And it doesn't matter where you start. If you're doubling your utility every few weeks, who cares where you start? It starts to take off real quick. So you don't want to be embarrassed. You don't want to be so embarrassed by where you are that it stops you from becoming who you could be.
And that's tough. It can be, that's real tough. I'm not making light of that. I see exactly why people avoid, but it's not a good solution.
To determine when you were being inauthentic or non-congruent. And I've thought about this for a long time and tried to sort it out in a practical manner, and what I've concluded is this. You can try this for a couple of weeks. It's an extremely interesting exercise. So you sort of have to detach yourself from your thoughts and what you say. So you got to assume, you start by assuming that what you say and what you think is not necessarily you. And of course that's just the case, because a lot of what you think, in fact most of what you think and most of what you say, are the opinions of other people. They're things you've read or things people have told you. You know, that's a benefit in some ways because you get all those thoughts that other people have spent a long time formulating, but it's a disadvantage in that it's not exactly you. Okay, so you detach yourself from that. You're no longer your thoughts or the things that you say, or maybe you're no longer all of them. And now what you're going to try to find out is which of your thoughts and things that you say are you, and maybe so you can not utilize the rest, or maybe so that you can correct the rest, because they're not representative of yourself as an integrated being. They don't take everything into account.
And so this is a good thing for people to know. If something bothers you, there's a billion things that could bother you, and not everything does. And so then you might ask, well, why does that thing bother you when some other thing that's equally bad doesn't? And as far as I can tell, the answer to that is because if it bothers you, that's your problem. And you might think, I don't want to have a problem. It's like, that's because you don't know that problems and opportunities are the same thing. So if a problem's crying out to you, then it could well be that your proper destiny is to address that problem, in which case it's an immense opportunity. And you saw that, exactly that. Oh, look, there's an absence in the marketplace. Well, that's a good discovery, an absence in the marketplace, especially if you're right. And so that's what you did. And then you got a movie out of it. So that's a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
You know, and that's independent of its eventual success as a movie, because even if it lands at any of the levels of success it could land at, you got to make a movie. And so that's pretty good. And God only knows what you learn doing that. So there's no loss in that, right?
Yeah.
There's just gain.
There was an interesting thing that I realized during this whole thing, and it is related to what you just said. So for many years, I have told people that if you have an idea and you don't execute on it, your idea doesn't mean anything. Ideas are a dime a dozen, and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And what I realized in making this movie is that I was actually wrong.
Okay.
Because if an idea, it's worthless if you don't execute it on it. I get that. But the actual idea, that if you have an idea, if you have an idea and it's good,
Yeah.
you can't even put a price tag on that thing. And that's why when you look at Hollywood makes a bunch of what are they called? Like reruns of the same movies, right? Yeah. There's a reason for that. They have all this money to throw at ideas, and they just go, well, you know what? Make the superhero movie again, make the space movie again. They just make the same movies often over and over again. And I realized that these, if you have a really good idea, you have to execute on it. You have to do something with it, because if you don't, it's like a mortal sin not to execute on a good. Well,
it's a revelation, a good idea. Yeah. It's a gift. It's grace.
Where does it come from? That's why I was kind of very curious.
That's exactly right. Because I know the answer to that.
I look at it like, they know what molecules are in an amoeba, right?
Yeah.
We know what chemicals and we know what's in it, but we can't make an amoeba. We can't make something alive. And just like in a movie or a book or a song, they know, you go to Nashville, they know what notes make a hit song, but they can't just produce a hit song. They can put all the chemicals in there, but they can't bring it to life. And so there is, just like there's something special about life, there's a spark that we don't understand. We can't fabricate it. We cannot fabricate that spark in life. And we can't, as far as I can tell, we can't fabricate that spark of an idea.
Okay, so there's a bunch of things that come off that. So one of the things I realized, so I've done a lot of lecturing again this year. I don't know how many different cities we went to.
60 or 70, over the last 8 months, maybe more than that, a lot. And I have a chance to develop my ideas every night. One of the things I came to understand more clearly was, this is a very cool thing, and it's relevant to what you just said, is that the spirit of your aim, you could say, answers your prayers or informs your thoughts. And it has to be that way because thought is a navigation tool, right? You set an aim, and then your perceptions line up so you can see your way forward, but your thoughts and your emotions also aid that, because you want to get there, let's say. And then the methods by which you might advance come to mind because you've set your aim. Okay, so we can take this apart in this idea that came to you. It's like you wanted to serve your children. Okay, you wanted to serve them in a manner that was better than what was being served to them. You wanted to serve them in a manner that would help them develop in this adventurous way. So that was your goal, your aim, when you went to the library. And then what happened was there was a mismatch between what you discovered and your aim. And so now that constitutes a problem, but it also constitutes an opportunity, right? Because now you see that if your aim was correct and there's a void, well, then that's a moral problem even. Okay, so now if it's a moral problem because your aim was right and the mechanisms for that aim to be manifested aren't available, well, then that's a genuine gap and it needs to be addressed. And if you figure that out, it's your moral responsibility to do something about it, but it's also your great opportunity. Okay, so there's that. So that's what you're serving. If your aim is correct and true, and you have a revelation in relationship to that aim, and you don't act on it, you've thrown away the pathway to that aim, and you've betrayed it. That's not a good idea. But even more concretely, one of the things my wife has really learned to do in the last 2 years, she started to write and she started to speak publicly because she introduces me and talks for about 10 minutes. And she's learned during our discussions, our private discussions, let's say, if an idea emerges, she writes it down right away, no matter what we're doing, right? The idea comes, you write that thing down because it's a gift and God only knows what it's worth. You could have a good idea now and then. It might be a good idea that changes your whole life. And you could have that idea and be casual enough to forget it. And that was that. And then you'd wonder why you never got anywhere. It's like, well, you had a gift and you didn't. And then there's another issue too, is the things that meet with reward grow. That's a neurological truth. That's how large language models are trained. They're trained with reinforcement. The closer they get to the target, the more weight is put on that response. So it's literally reward that trains large language models to match to target. Well, if you have a bit of a creative spark and ideas are being revealed to you in concordance with your aim, and then you don't act on those, you punish them. You punish the source of the ideas. Just like demoralizing a kid. Like if a kid comes to you with ideas and every time they come, you say, oh, that's stupid, or what the hell do you know? Or you say, I'm going to do something about that, and then you don't. That kid will stop coming to you with ideas. Mm-hmm. And people do that to themselves all the time. Yep. And so you even have an obligation to you can watch this, This is what I've been trying to teach people too, is if you want to improve your life, it's like, well, set that as an aim. I'd like things to be better. And then ask, what could I actually do that would move me somewhat in that direction? You'll get an answer. That's a good way to pray. That's a good way to pray.
And I've experienced two things here, and these are like the opposite ends of the spectrum. And this is, I think, a very positive thing for people to hear. If I was a young person, I would really like to hear this. So there are going to be times like you're talking about with your wife where all of a sudden from nowhere, or from somewhere, but somewhere that we don't know and understand, all of a sudden there's an idea there.
The source of all revelation.
It shows up.
Yeah.
It shows up. I've had that happen to me where it's like, boom, I wrote a book called Mikey and the Dragons. That came just boom. I just instantly had this idea. Boom, I wrote the book.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was an English major in college, and some of the old poets, they would claim that, they just wrote this first, the first draft, that was it. It was one draft, one shot. And there was sort of rumors about that's not really happened. They found their notes. They'd written a bunch of drafts. But sometimes it's true. Sometimes you will get that inspiration, and it'll come, and boom, you're done.
Yeah.
So you can sit around and wait for that. I don't recommend waiting for that, though. It may or may not come.
Yeah.
We can't control that. The other side of the spectrum, which I've also had this happen to me, and my silly term that I came up with for it is squeezing your brain. You have to like squeeze your brain and squeeze something out of it. And what I like is this idea, just to come full circle a little bit here. You know, I had this thing where I wanted to have lessons for my kids that they could read in a book.
Yeah.
And so I have that. There's my aim, what you would call an aim.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't immediately say, oh, okay, what I can have as a kid that's going through kind of kid problems, and his uncle, who's a Navy SEAL, can come and stay with him for the summer and he can teach him. I didn't have that. And I definitely didn't have the nuances of like, oh, he can get bullied by this kid. And he can time save.
That fills in.
Right. But I squeezed on my brain and thought, what would be a good, and then all of a sudden, boom, you just start, you find your path, and the story will come, or the idea will come. And
Well, that's part of that disciplined striving. Like I learned when I first started writing, I forced myself to sit and write every day. And some days I was highly productive, and other days I wasn't so productive. But every day, if I sat long enough, I was a little bit productive. And then I got better at being productive, and much better at not delaying sitting down. That took a long time, really years, to really get disciplined. I'm still learning that discipline, right? I mean,
how long do you write for at a time?
I max out about 3 hours.
Okay.
I find that if I write more than 3 hours continually, I get exhausted. So 3 hours is about right. And I've learned tricks like at the end of the writing session, write down what you're thinking so you can use that the next day, and do it every day, and so on. And I've got to the point now where I can write a newspaper article, a good newspaper article, pretty much in one draft. But that's taken 35 years of writing to manage that. But I learned early that if I sat long enough, I would write something that would be valuable, right? And some days it took like 45 minutes to get warmed up, so that, you know, everything I wrote was just painful to produce and not of very high quality. But if you persist, the thing that persistence, that's the other thing that's kind of interesting neurologically. You know, I already said, if you punish the source within you that gives rise to ideas, it will stop producing ideas. So that's a bad idea. But it's also the case that you want to make being creative the victor over all the competing pulls and temptations. And partly what you're doing when you're disciplining yourself is that. It's like, no, I'm going to sit here, regardless of all the other things I could be doing, all the other things I could be thinking, until that part of me that's able to create wins that internal battle and prevails. And then it gets stronger and stronger over time. And that's building character. That's exactly what that is.
So do you want to start by explaining to people, let's walk through your research on the dark triad. How did you become interested in this, and how did you develop the measurement instruments, and what do you measure?
Well, like a lot of academics, my research can be traced back to my advisor, who was Richard Christie, the inventor of Machiavellianism as a trait. And he did something very clever. He went into the books of Niccolo Machiavelli, who was an advisor to politicians way back when, and he took the statements, administered them to undergraduate students, and simply asked them, how much do you agree with these statements? Like, you have to get to know important people, and always be prepared for the worst in people. And the amazing thing was the huge variance in the responses. And that's what personality research is all about. We look for and wallow in, relish the fact that people give different answers. And apparently, a lot of people agreed totally with the statements that Machiavelli made in the 1500s. Others were horrified by them. And so that inspired Richard Christie to make a questionnaire the Mach 4, the most popular version of his questionnaires, was administered to subject pools at his university, Columbia University, and elsewhere. And it wasn't just self-reports, it predicted actual behavior. So he could show that people who scored high on the Mach 4 manipulated others in a room in a laboratory. So they would try to squeeze money out of other people by tricking them, and all of this could be recorded and published. Hence, Richard Christie is forever associated with Machiavellianism. So I thought that was a fabulous way to do research. I moved on then and took a real job at the University of British Columbia and met up there with Bob Hare, sort of the emperor of research on psychopathy, another aversive trait. And of course, he has done it all, but what he didn't do was compare it to Machiavellianism. And I've also done some research separately on narcissism, which captured attention of researchers in the 1980s because it seems to resonate. Everybody knows narcissists, people who want a lot of attention and think they are superior to everyone else. Everyone can resonate to knowing such people. So we have 3 personality variables. Then when the student, Kevin Williams, came along, and typically in my career, I go with what the students want to do, we decided to figure out whether there were more. Are there more aversive personalities? So we searched the literature, and we did as much as we could back then, early 2000s, to cover all the literature and see if there were more personalities that were at the level of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. We called them the dark triad because they seem to dominate the literature. There are already hundreds of studies on each one of those. The unfortunate results, fortunate in the long run, I suppose, is that the literature's overlapped so much you could barely tell the difference. If you took all the literature on narcissism, all the literature on Machiavellianism and psychopathy, you could see the same things coming up. And that was the original problem. We want to parse the dark side of traits, but you can't really do much with the literature because of this phenomenon that we called construct creep. And that is, a researcher doesn't have the ability to research everything at once, so they focus on one variable. But it creeps wider and wider until it overlaps with other variables. And that's a problem because you don't know which one you're actually studying when you put it into a research program. Which one is responsible for the action you're seeing?
Right. Well, we want to talk about that in some more detail too, because I'd like to find out a bit more about how you feel. I know that the dark triad has morphed into the dark tetrad to some degree, and I'm also curious as to what you have to say about the overlap between the dark tetrad qualities and personality disorder categories, especially in the histrionic, antisocial, and narcissistic categories. Obviously, that shades into personality pathology. And so can I define the 3 traits and have you correct my definitions, if you would? So the Machiavellians, as you pointed out, Machiavelli was an advisor to princes who was really interested in some sense in the outright maintenance of instrumental power. I wouldn't say he was driven by any intrinsic ethic. It was Machiavelli gave advices to princes who wanted to maintain their position by hook or by crook, let's say. So Machiavellians are willing to use manipulation to obtain their personal ends. And narcissists seem to be driven by a high desire to obtain unearned status from others. And the most important thing for them is not status in relationship to competence, let's say, or in relationship to performance, but just in status for its own sake. And then the psychopaths, I spent a lot of time looking at Hare's research and thinking about it in relationship to the big five. Psychopaths seem to be something approximating parasitical predators. And so they're very, very low in agreeableness, and that makes them callous and non-empathetic. And then they also seem to be very low in conscientiousness. That seems to accord reasonably well with the two factors of the psychopathy scale. And so a real psychopath is someone who is willing to take what you have, let's say, and use it, and that might be the predatory aspect, and also to live off the earnings and efforts of others, and that's also an element of criminal behavior. And so you're looking at the nexus of all three of those: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. And recently, you and other researchers have added, I think this is so interesting because I think it was a real lack, you added sadism to that, which is positive delight and pleasure taken in the suffering of others. And so can you expand at all upon the definitions of Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy? And we could segue into sadism.
Yeah, I agree with all of your definitions, although what we did was spend a lot of time trying to find what's different among each of the characters and what the overlap is. Why is it that the literatures and the measures that were available always overlapped to a dangerous degree in trying to understand what's going on? So the key thing for psychopaths, in our opinion, is impulsivity and sensation seeking, which is what gets them into trouble. They may not have worse motives than the others, but they can't help it. That's why they, at the extreme levels, spend their lives in prison. They can't help responding to temptation. Whatever the temptation is, they go for it. And often they get what they want right away, and they keep on doing it until they get caught, and they don't seem to learn from it. So that answers just a qualification to the definition of psychopath. Now, what's underlying it, we think, is callousness for all of them. They're overlapping because at the core is a failure to have empathy. And if you have a deficit in empathy, it seems inevitable that you're going to exploit other people in one way or another because you're not getting the feedback that people with empathy get in seeing other people suffer at your hands. And the story of sadism is quite a long story, but if you want me to get into the details,
sure.
I can do that now.
Yeah, please do, please do.
Yeah, I don't know whether I'm more sensitive to these things than other people, but I started seeing sadism in regular people. And not only is it there in everyday people, but people seem to wallow in it when the circumstances allow it. For example, violent sports. One of my favorite sports, hockey. It's kind of pathetic watching a hockey game. The cheers are larger for the fights than for the goals. People love to see their fighter pummel the fighter of the other team or pummel anyone. And the cheers that go up in a hockey stadium are incredible. And the cheers only stop when the victim falls to the ice and starts twitching. Then a hush follows over the crowd, showing the dual nature of positive and negative motivations that human beings have. But the fact that they love seeing the fighting, no matter how much blood is and teeth end up on the ice is disappointing in a way. And we learned a long time ago from the Europeans, they don't have to do that to make hockey a wonderful sport. That was just one. But then watching the undergraduate students at UBC, University of British Columbia, what are they doing for fun? Well, if you'll recall, way, way back, they used to play these archive games. And there were some gentle ones, Pac-Man, Asteroids. I don't know if you remember those. But going down into the arcade, you see that people are gathered around one of the arcade games. And so I wandered over to see it. And it was something called Mortal Kombat, which by today's standards isn't that bad. But the heads are torn off and the blood spurts out. And that's why the crowd was there, because it was so much more appealing than the silly little Mario Brothers stuff. And it just struck me as the beginning of my interest in what people do, especially young males, when they have time on their own. So if it's not porn, then it seems like it's violence, and it's somewhat horrifying, but it's gotten worse. I don't know if you've been following the video games that are now available on your home computer. You don't need to go to an arcade and be embarrassed by what you're playing, because you can sit at home and play whatever games you want. And so now, what's it called? Grand Theft Auto. You can kill innocent bystanders, step on their heads, etc. And there are actual torture sites where you can go and torture people. You can torture animals. It's all there. And so people are paying to do this stuff. They pay for violent sports. They pay for violent movies. What's the most popular television program these days? It's called Game of Thrones. And it's the most sadistic kind of television program that you've ever seen. People are paying for this in one way or another, and they're attracted to it. They relay stories with their friends. So putting this picture together suggested to me that some, not all, in fact, the variance again is there, which excites a personality researcher. Some people are highly attracted to this stuff. Other people are horrified.
I studied psychopaths for a long time. And you think of psychopaths as selfish, right? Self-centered. Right. But it's weird because psychopaths betray themselves all the time because they don't learn from experience. So they get what they want now, but they fail. And so then I thought, oh, well, psychopaths don't care about other people. They also don't care about their future selves. Then I thought, oh, that's the same thing.
They don't learn from remorse because they don't have remorse.
They don't. Well, they certainly don't have remorse.
The dark triads, or you like to talk about dark tetrads when you bring in sadism, of course.
Yeah.
But the characteristic of people above average in psychopathy is the lack of remorse.
Yeah, well,
and a lack of remorse is an inability to learn.
Yes.
You hurt somebody, you did something wrong, it had consequences. If you don't feel remorse, that remorse is activating the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex of your brain, which is making you feel social pain.
Right.
You don't feel that if you have psychopathic tendencies.
Yes, and then, well, and if that pain doesn't make itself, like, I think that pain is the felt sense of the eradication of a neurological system. So, like, imagine that a system emerges in this Darwinian sense to dominate.
Right.
So now you're under its sway. Okay, now it has a goal in mind, and when it makes itself manifest, it fails. Okay, the consequence of that failure should be the destruction of that system. I think that felt pain is the psychological consequence of the death of a system that failed to meet its goals.
Right.
Now, it's going to struggle and fight to maintain itself, even in the face of failure, right? Which is why it's hard to get rid of a bad habit, for example.
Right.
It's a living thing.
Right,
it's not going to give up without a struggle.
Right.
But the corollary of that would be approximately equivalent to what you just said.
there's no learning because there's no remorse, because there's no difference between remorse and learning. The first stage of learning is, oh,
oops,
I was wrong.
Yeah.
That has to go. That's a sacrificial offering too, right? That part of me has to go.
Right.
And it's going, no, I want to live. And fair enough. And sometimes, like if you're really poorly oriented in your life and you fail cataclysmically, an awful lot of you has to go. You know, when
and by the way, this gets back to your wife talking about gratitude, by the way, because the same thing. It's the prefrontal cortex saying, no. You limbic system evolved to feel resentment. That's maladaptive.
Yes.
And I have decided to reprogram the limbic system, which tends toward resentment, and I'm going to reprogram it toward. It's the same basic pattern. This is self-management. This is the essence of self-leadership. Doing what feels good. If it feels good, do it. If it feels bad, avoid it. Is being managed by your ancestors.
Yeah, well, the problem with that attitude is, well, in relationship to who and over what time span, right? And that's a huge problem. If you have a dominant lobster, I did a lot of investigation into crustacean,
crustaceans,
neurology, because it's well mapped out. If a dominant lobster who ages is defeated in a battle, his brain dissolves and reconstitutes as a subordinate brain. Right. Exactly the same thing happens to us.
Because the neuromodulator activity in the limbic system of the lobster brain. Because, once again, because the psychology is biology.
Yep.
The lobster can't do anything about that. The big dominant alpha lobster, if there is such a thing, is going to fight to try to maintain that position.
Yes. And if it
can
fails,
decide.
the lobster brain is so simple that it can't be subordinate sometimes and dominant sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's either victor or not. And when it loses, the victor brain is no good. So it has to go. And so it dissolves.
We can make decisions, and that's the divine in us. That's the difference. And
yes,
this is the essence of being fully human, fully alive. St. Irenaeus said, the glory of God is a man fully alive. What does it mean to be a man fully alive? It is managing your limbic system. It is not deciding that your level of affect that you have today is going to actually be the determining factor in how you treat other people. It is actually, getting beyond who you were as a person. It's deciding to worship even though you don't feel a single milligram of faith on a particular day.
When everything falls apart for Job, his wife says, and we presume she loves him and that she knows he's a good man. She says, there's nothing left for you but to curse God and die.
Right.
And she means it.
Yeah.
And his attitude is, no matter what's happening to me right now, no matter the depth of my suffering, I refuse to lose faith in my central goodness, and I refuse to lose faith in the essential goodness of being and becoming itself. And that is a decision, right? It's a decision.
Right.
Right, because it's weird, because the evidence, and this is what his wife tells him, it's like, the evidence is that you're done. You've tried really hard. You were a good person. Everyone knows it, even God. And yet, everything's been stripped away from you, and you're in the most miserable imaginable position. You should curse God and die. That's what you would do if you were acting in accordance with the facts.
If you're purely limbic, there are lots and lots of people who make an absolutely a logical decision to commit suicide. If they're purely limbic. However, the divine in us, the divine console that allows us to manage our ancestral, our less evolved selves,
default self.
It's the bumper of tissue behind your forehead called the prefrontal cortex, which is what a miracle. My dog Chucho can't do that. He can't time travel. He can't manage his emotions. The essence of being fully alive is doing exactly that. This is the message that we can give to all these young people today who are so desperate. They don't have to live like Jordan Peterson and Arthur Brooks. They don't have to go, suffer through a PhD. They don't have to become behavioral scientists. They have to learn to manage themselves. They have to put their prefrontal cortex in charge of their limbic systems. That's what, and that takes practice, and that takes commitment, and that takes good relationships that will actually bring that along. It's interesting because the best indicator of somebody being able to manage in a man, his limbic system, is a good partner. Job's wife is the one who says, curse God and die, right? Interestingly, chapter 38 of Job is where he puts God in the dock. And he says, all right, Everybody told me to, curse you and die and
Yeah.
all this bad stuff. So what gives? I'm
Yeah.
a righteous man. What gives? And then
Yeah.
God actually turns it around and says, what do you know?
Yeah,
Oh, you're
right.
so smart.
Yeah.
Where were you when I created
Yeah,
the
yeah.
stars in the sky?
Yeah, the whole story is not evident
Yeah.
to you.
Yeah,
and
exactly
Job
right.
accepts that. He says,
that's
look, I can
humility.
take solace in my ignorance.
Exactly right.
Yeah, which is very useful. To take solace, because your ignorance is infinite.
Yeah.
There's a lot of place for solace in that.
Self-management is the essence of, humility requires self-management too. We're not evolved to be humble.
Yes.
We are evolved as tribal societies to be humbled, but not to be humble.
Mm-hmm.
To be voluntarily humble is a decision that can actually lead us to live our best
Right,
lives.
that's wisdom.
And that's the 30th chapter of Job. That's the capstone of that thing. That's the big point at the end of the day, where he is victorious, but still doesn't understand, puts God in the dock, and then is taught humility and accepts that humility and then thrives.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back at happiness. So because what you could say that the folk understanding of happiness is something like the gratification of a toddler's whim.
Right.
Right. A toddler's having a tantrum in a store, and his mother, defeated, gives him the chocolate bar. And so now the child stops squawking and bitching and being subsumed by negative emotions.
Right.
And maybe smiles. And so you think, well, that's happiness.
Right.
Okay, but that's not the kind of happiness that you're describing.
That's gratification.
Okay.
Just gratification. And that's a feeling.
Okay, so look, if you're hedonistically oriented, why not be skeptical about your proposition that it's something other than immediate hedonistic gratification that constitutes happiness?
And certainly Epicurus would have been, and so the whole Epicurean tradition of trying to maintain positive feelings as much as possible.
Yes.
And again, he wasn't a hedonist in the modern sense. He was actually a highly moral character. But the whole point is to have peace in your life and surround yourself with people who like you and to have non-disagreeable conversations and to set your life up that has as little conflict as possible, which is catastrophically wrong. Because unless you have sanctified suffering in your life, you will not become strong, you will not learn, you will not grow, and you'll make no progress on your
Well, you also won't be able to withstand suffering when it comes.
Which is
it
inevitable.
will.
It's like my students ask me, so professor, are you saying I need to go look for suffering? I say, don't worry,
No,
it will find you.
Yeah, right. You don't need to look for it. This is one of the great stories of mankind, and this isn't the only variant of this story. There's many variants of it, but this variant is useful for our purposes. It's a story I stumbled across a long time ago. I'm going to tell you the second story first because I don't have the energy to tell you the first story. So this is a story that the ancient Egyptians predicated their society on. And to understand this story, the first thing you have to know is what the characters were, and these characters were gods. There's 4 of them, although the Egyptians had far more than 4 gods. You might think of these as the central gods. And you might think, what is a central god? And then you might think, well, imagine that the gods compete for dominance across time in people's imaginations. And some gods win. And they occupy the primary position of dominance in the hierarchy, in the dominance hierarchy of gods. And those are ideals. And ideals compete across time for dominance. And they're embodied. And so when diverse tribal people come together, they throw all their gods into the ring and they fight across time, and something emerges as a victor. And that's the emergence of monotheism out of polytheism. And it parallels the development of a unified morality within each of us as we develop across time. And the God that emerges as dominant across time bears a substantial resemblance. Imagine you have a set of gods in this locale that are competing across time, and something emerges as dominant. And then over here you have another set of gods that compete across time for dominance, and something emerges. You'll see major commonalities across the 2 things that emerge. And the reason for that is because the process of emergence that gives rise to both of them is similar in both situations. And that's part of what accounts for the cross-cultural similarity of high-order religious ideas. All right, anyways, you need to know the characters. Osiris. Osiris is the old king.
He's Dumbledore for all intents and purposes. He's the old king. He's the spirit that established the Egyptian state when he was young. He was a great hero, but now he's old. And he's archaic and he's willfully blind. That's Osiris. He has a brother, Seth. Seth is Set, and Set is Satan, because the word Satan comes from the word Seth and Set via the Coptic Christians. So he's a precursor to the Western idea of Satan. You have Isis. Isis is queen of the underworld, and Isis was the goddess of a religious structure that prevailed across thousands and thousands of years. Isis. And you have Horus. Horus is a falcon, and the Egyptian eye. Everyone knows that eye, right? The eye with the open pupil. That's Horus. And Horus is a falcon because falcons can see way better. They can see better than us. They can see better than anything else except for perhaps eagles. And they fly above everything. Zazu in Lion King is Horus, right? And Mufasa is Osiris. And Scar is Seth. And there's no specific representation of Isis, but the closest there is in that story is probably the Queen of the Hyenas that's played by, who's the actress? Yes, Whoopi Goldberg. That's right. That's right. Because she's like the queen of the underworld, right? She's the queen of the hyenas that live out among the death. But okay, anyways, Seth, Osiris, Seth, Isis, and Horus. Here's how the story goes. Osiris is a great king. He established the Egyptian state. You could think about him as the embodiment of Egyptian custom and tradition. You could think about him as the thing that the pyramid represents, all right? But he was great when he was young, but he's not young anymore. He's old, and he's willfully blind. And what that means is that he doesn't see what he could see. He refuses to see what he could see. Why is Osiris old and willfully blind? Because that's what culture is. It's a paternal spirit that's old and willfully blind, and it's always that way, always that way. And the reason for that is because it's a construction of the dead. The dead aren't alive. They can't, so they're out of date, and they can't update themselves anymore. And you inhabit their corpse. And that's actually what happens in an earlier story that I'll tell you next week. The early Mesopotamian gods inhabited the corpse of their father, roughly speaking. Anyway, so Osiris was great and when he was young, but he isn't young anymore. He's old and he's willfully blind. He won't look where he knows he should look. He doesn't have the energy, or maybe he doesn't have the spirit. His brother Seth is not a good guy, and Osiris knows it, but he underestimates his malevolence and power. And so Seth wants to rule the kingdom. So what does that mean? It's easy. Every stable society is threatened by willful blindness and malevolence, always. Every bureaucracy has that proclivity to stagnate and to become blind. That's why corporations die all the time. That's why a Fortune 500 company only lasts 30 years. It's why we have to have elections. It's to stop the dead from staying in control for too long. Osiris turns a blind eye to Seth. Seth is happy about that. Same thing happens in the Lion King, roughly speaking. Seth one day waits for Osiris to make a mistake and to be weak, and he attacks him and he chops him up into pieces. And he distributes the pieces across the entire Egyptian state. In fact, the Egyptians regarded their provinces as pieces of Osiris's body. Okay, so now you can't kill Osiris because he's a god. And why is he God? A god because he represents the spirit of structure. And there's always structure. It can't be destroyed. It always reconstitutes itself. It can be hurt and broken into pieces, which is exactly what happens to Osiris. Things fall apart. Why? Because they get old and because malevolence undermines them. That's what the Egyptians were trying to sort out. Okay, so Seth distributes his Osiris all over Egypt so he can't get himself back together. Right? Things fall apart and they can't be brought back together. But the spirit of Osiris still lives in the pieces. So what happens? Order is demolished. What would you expect? Chaos emerges. That's Isis. Isis is queen of the underworld. She's Osiris's wife. Order and chaos, just like the yin and the yang. Order collapses, up comes the queen of the underworld. She's looking for order. Chaos cries out for order. She's looking for order. She goes all around Egypt trying to put Osiris back together. It's a state of chaos. She finds this phallus. She makes herself pregnant with it. And what does that mean? Well, it means it's like Geppetto in the belly of the whale. That thing has the potential to reemerge. The thing that collapses into its pieces is still alive. It can unite with the chaos and produce something new. That's the story of the dissolution of structure into chaos and then its revivification. Isis makes herself pregnant. She goes back down to the underworld. She gives birth to Horus. Horus is the Egyptian eye. He's the son of the great father and the great mother. He's a messianic figure. And in fact, much of the mythology that described Horus was extracted without much modification and then attributed to Christ. Very much, and you can read about the parallels. You can read about it online if you want. But there's any number of parallels. And of course, there is the mythology that the Jews came out of Egypt, and of course the Christians emerged from the Jews. And so there was a tremendous influence of Egyptian thinking on the development of these later ideas. And you see pictures of Isis with Horus on her lap that are virtually identical in content and form to the later pictures of Mary with the infant Christ. And that's the holy mother of God in the hero. It's not a Christian motif. It's far deeper than a Christian motif. It's a human motif. So Isis, queen of the underworld, gives birth to Horus, and Horus grows up outside the kingdom. Why? In underworld. Because that's what human beings do. You're alienated from your culture. Always. Why? It's old and dead and corrupt. And so that leaves you growing up in chaos. What would you call alienated from your fundamental culture. That's the story of adolescence. Horus grows up. He can see. That's what differentiates him from Osiris. That's why he's a falcon. He goes and has a fight with Seth. And now the difference between Osiris and Horus is that Horus does not underestimate Seth. He knows exactly what he's up against. He goes and has a terrible battle with him, trying to get his kingdom back. Something else that's echoed in the Lion King story. And while Horus and Osiris or Seth are fighting, Seth tears out one of his eyes. Now why? Because Seth is the embodiment of destruction and malevolence, and no matter how conscious you are, if you encounter that, even voluntarily, the probability that it's going to damage your consciousness is extraordinarily high. That's why people don't do it. So the eye is torn out, but Seth is defeated, and Horus banishes him to the nether regions of the kingdom. You can't kill him. Why? Because the malevolent, destructive force that threatens states never dies. It's always there. You can only remove it temporarily. Now Horus is king. Pharaoh, king, God. He's got his eye. And so you think, well, he's going to just pop that back in his head, and then he's going to be able to lead. He's going to be able to take his place at the uppermost pantheon of gods properly. But that isn't what he does. He takes his eye and he goes back to the underworld, just like Pinocchio going into the depths to rescue Geppetto. And down there is the spirit of Osiris, who's extant as a kind of half-dead ghost. And he gives Osiris his eye. Now Osiris can see. So what does that mean? You go down into the chaotic, when threatened by malevolence, even to the point of damage to your consciousness. You go down into the chaos and you find the dead spirit of your tradition and you give it vision. And so, provided with vision, Osiris regenerates, and then Osiris and Horus go back up to the world, linked together and rule jointly. And the Egyptians believed that the pharaoh, who had an immortal spirit, was the embodiment of the conjunction of Horus and Osiris. And that's what gave him sovereignty. And so you think about how brilliant that is. The Egyptians are trying to puzzle out who should lead, who should be pharaoh, and what do you have to be if you're going to be pharaoh in order for things to work. You have to be awake to malevolence and chaos, and you have to embody your tradition. And that puts you at the highest pinnacle of the dominant structure. And that's the same as, it's the same thing. It's the same thing as the battle between the gods across centuries or eons and the emergence of the highest possible moral virtue as a consequence of that competition. It's the eye on the top of the pyramid, right? It's, you know, in the Washington Monument, there's a cap on the Washington Monument. The top of the Washington Monument is a pyramid. At the top of the pyramid is a cap. It's made out of aluminum. And the reason it's made out of aluminum is because when they made the Washington Monument, it was the most valuable metal known. And so what does it mean? It means there's a pyramid and there's something at the top of it. But the thing that's at the top of the pyramid isn't the same as the rest of the pyramid. That's the thing. The pyramid exists. There's a dominance hierarchy. Something climbs up to the top, but it's not just at the top of one pyramid. It's at the top of all of them. The thing that rises to the top of any given pyramid is the same thing that can dominate all pyramids. It isn't good enough to be the best at a dominance hierarchy. What you want to be is the best at the set of all possible dominance hierarchies. Right. And that's the thing that's gold at the top of the pyramid, and that's the eye. That's what the Egyptians figured out. And what does that mean? It means the thing that puts you at the top is attention. Pay attention. Keep your eyes open. It's not the same as thinking. It's not the same thing. It's like watching. And the thing about human beings is we can see. We can see better than any other creature except birds of prey. And so our capacity to see is in fact what we use in the world. Our brains are actually organized around vision, unlike most animals. Their brains are organized around smell, not us. We can see. We stand upright so we can see a long distance. And in our ability to see is what saves us and what saves our communities. And that's what these stories are trying to portray. And you might say, well, why didn't people just say so? And the answer to that is because they didn't know. It took a long time to figure it out. Forever. It's taken forever to figure it out. It's part of what I hoped when I wrote this book, and part of the reason that I'm teaching it is because it seems to me that it would be useful for everyone to actually understand this instead of just having it told as a story. It's like, that's great, man. Yes, you need the story. But why not also just understand it?
They use power to exploit those who are weak. That explains all economic relationships. You can apply the same lens to history. History is nothing but the power struggle between different claims to power. That is absolutely what people are being taught in our institutes of higher education. And it's unlikely that there's a doctrine that's more corrosive in relationship to the actual spirit upon which your country and the free West in general was founded. Those are antithetical stories. Well, what's the alternative story? Well, let's lay some out. Here's another story. Do what you want will be the totality of the law. That's a somewhat mangled quotation from Aleister Crowley, who was a Satanist in the late part of the 1800s. He was like a disciple of the Marquis de Sade. He was one of these people who believed, as you can believe rationally, that why the hell shouldn't I do just exactly what I want whenever I want to whoever I want, regardless of, well, let's say the cost to them. What's the rational argument against that? What if I have power and I won't get caught, for example? If I just get away with what? The untrammeled expression of my most primordial desires. Why not let that be the story? One whim after another. That's the hedonistic story. It's a cacophony, that story, because as you know from your own experience, if you give yourself over to your immediate wants, you're just one appetite after another, right? There's no real coherence there. You basically have the same psychological status as a very badly behaved 2-year-old. Well, 2-year-olds are like that. They don't have a integrated, their fundamental pattern of being and personality isn't integrated yet. And so they're more or less at the mercy of their whims. And a hedonist is a worshiper of his own whims, right? And he's a pagan in that sense because it's just one damn desire after another. And he might say to himself, well, those are my desires. He might identify with those desires. And that's really, what would you say, the cardinal form of identification in the modern world.
I identify with what my wants are, particularly sexual wants. That constitutes my identity, and anyone who gets in the way can go directly to hell. And that's a very pathological mode of being, and there's a variety of reasons for it, not least that it's exactly reflective of the same kind of immaturity that makes 2-year-olds entirely self-centered and driven by instinct. Now, you might say, well, what's wrong with that? You know, and 2-year-olds have their delightful element. You know, they're very enthusiastic, they're very spontaneous, they're kind of alive in a fiery way, but they're completely incapable of taking care of themselves, right? And this isn't a hypothesis. You don't see roving bands of thriving 2-year-olds running through the forest organizing themselves. Well, why not? Well, it's because that short-term, self-centered, whim-dominated possession doesn't allow you to exist in the world. You have to mature, and of course, that's what you're trying to do with your kids as a parent, is you're trying to shepherd them through the process of maturation. Well, why? Well, how about so they have some friends? Because if it's all about them, well, then they don't have any friends, and that goes for all of you, too. If it's all about you, good luck with your marriage. If it's all about you, you don't have friends. You might have, if you're a bully in particular, you might have, you know, toadies and thugs who benefit from your use of power, but you don't have friends. If you exploit your customers as a business person repeatedly to redound to your own immediate advantage, you're not going to have customers for very long. Your reputation is going to precede you. You're not going to do well in the world. So what do you do instead? Power is a bad story. It's a corrupt way of looking at the world. It leads to violence. It's generally manifested in service to a narrow kind of hedonism, because why have power unless it's to get exactly what the hell the worst of you wants from moment to moment? If you're not under the sway of some self-centered and relatively malevolent whim, you don't need to use power on other people, because you could just ask them to go along for the journey. And maybe they would. That's what you do when you play instead of when you use force. That's what you do when you invite instead of using force. That's what you do when you establish a vision that other people share instead of being a tyrant. Well, that's what you do if you're mature. That's even what 2-year-olds understand by the time they're 3, when they start engaging in pretend play with a would-be friend. Who's a friend to a 2-year-old? Well, the first thing, or 3-year-old, because 3-year-olds start to become social. Well, the first thing you want to do if you're a 3-year-old is play a game with someone. That's not the same as having your own game, right? If you play a game with someone else, there are some intrinsic rules. Well, what are the rules? Well, how about they get a turn, right? And maybe a generous turn, right? Because if you're going to have a friend and you want the friend to like you, which is kind of like the definition of a friend, and someone who likes you would like to see you again, and that continuity of the desire to see you again and to play together, that's the definition of friendship. It's a sequence of games played with the same person. The game has to be voluntary, it has to be invitational, it has to be reciprocal, right? And so what you're trying to do with your 2-year-old is you're getting them to sacrifice the immediate gratification of their instincts to reciprocity, right? Now you do something that's a bit more sophisticated than that too, because the other thing you do with children and yourself and with people you love, if you're the least bit sensible, is you let them know that they shouldn't conduct themselves in a manner in the immediate present that compromises their future, right? That's what you mean when you tell your child, don't do stupid things. Well, what's a stupid thing, generally speaking? Something interesting and entertaining in the moment that you pay for, right? And that's the same as an impulsive bad habit in adulthood. It's like the definition of a bad habit. A bad habit is something that works now and not so good tomorrow, or next week, or next month, or next year, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. That implies as well that just as the child establishes a relationship of reciprocity with the friend, by starting to understand the future, they establish a reciprocal relationship with their future self.
And that's the same thing. So what maturation is, we all know this, maturation is the ability, let's say, to share and to forego gratification, to delay gratification. What does it mean to delay gratification? It means you don't get what the hell you want right now all the time. You have to conduct yourself in a manner that assures communal stability, let's say, and reciprocity. And in the enjoyable sense, you want to be surrounded by friends and compatriots and people who move you forward and people who wish you well, because that's going to be a lot better for you than the alternative. And you want to do that in a manner that assures the future. The whole higher cortical apparatus that human beings are blessed and cursed with is there to integrate the possessing spirits that might otherwise be impulsive and fractionating, to integrate them into a personality that can act reciprocally in relationship to others and guide itself as a consequence of apprehension of the future. It's a definition of maturity. Now, you kind of know this because as your children mature, as you've matured, the amount of time you can consider expands, right? For the 13-year-old, for a 4-year-old sitting down to take piano lessons, half an hour is an eternity, right? For a 13-year-old, 6 months into the future is forever. By the time you're 50, a year is like a week, right? Well, and there's a loss in that to some degree, but there's a huge gain because as you develop, your capacity to apprehend the consequences of your actions across broader spans of time is much improved, and that reflects cortical maturation. And the same thing happens with regards to your ability to manage yourself socially. What does it mean to manage yourself socially? Well, it means, as I said, that it's not all about you. Your aim can't be the immediate gratification of the whims that possess you. If you're married, if you have a wife or husband, is your wife or husband, how do they stand in relationship to their importance in relationship to you? Well, we could just think about it in a sort of clear-headed manner. Let's say you have a scrap with your wife, you have a fight with your wife, a disagreement, and you win. You win. She's wrong. She's punished for it, whatever way you can manage. What's the problem with that? You're right, she's wrong. Well, let's say you do that 50 times. Well, now you're living with someone you always defeat. And so now you're living with someone who's defeated. And what's the problem with that? Well, they're around. Right, and so maybe that's the problem with attaining a manipulated victory over your marital partner. Fine if it's a one-off, but you know they're there when you wake up in the morning. And so is the consequence of your, what? Self-centered, power-based maneuvering? Right? And maybe you're a victorious tyrant and she's a defeated slave. Well, that's not much of a victory there, buddy. Right? And the same applies to any reciprocal social relationship. You know, if you have any sense, if you think it through, you want to build up the people that are around you. Well, why? Well, because they're around you. And so if you made generous offerings to the social world and you improved the nexus of relationships that you were involved in, why wouldn't that be good for you? Now, you might think, well, there's only so much to go around, and if everyone else wins, I lose. But that's another story, and it's the story of power. And it's a very bad story, and it's not true. Because the truth of the matter is that there's more than enough for everyone to do, and your victory doesn't have to ever come at the cost of someone else's defeat. I shouldn't say ever. I mean, there are times when, you know, people are head-to-head, and the game that's being played isn't fair, and it's your victory or your defeat. But those are very pathological and unnecessary circumstances, and it would be better to do everything you can to ever avoid being in a situation like that. Situations like that arise when your relationships have deteriorated radically.